On this. Oh, recording's in progress. Like Jackie said, my name's Courtney Hubbs, and I am the Project Aware Coordinator at OPI. I also am the Mental Health and Wellness Resource Coordinator. Sorry, I don't go by that title very often, and I really should change it. Um, so a little about me. I've been licensed as an addiction counselor for the last 5 years, and really my whole career has been focused on mental health and different roles related to mental illness and co-occurring disorders. And one of the reasons why I came to OPI is because I really wanted to shift my focus into prevention. And I spent a lot of my career working with adults who struggled with addiction and mental health disorders, and seeing a lot of their struggles that started in early childhood and not having proper intervention early on is really what drove me over to OPI. And so I'm really excited to talk about this topic today, and I'm thankful that Jackie wanted to focus on mental health and bring me into this.
We're glad to have you, Courtney. And you guys know the drill. You see this every time. But I'm glad to be here and doing this work. And I'm a literacy person, but mental health is equal in importance to me. And I'm not afraid to talk about it and say that I think it's important. And so we hope this is going to be a lot of information, but we hope you get something that you can move forward with. Just a reminder, the mission here at OPI is to provide the vision, advocacy, support, and leadership for schools and communities to ensure that all students meet today's challenges and tomorrow's opportunities. Our community agreements: take care of yourself. If you need to do something, do it, but be fully present. Turn on your camera if you're brave enough. Take risks, participate in the conversation, and be mindful of others. Just please keep yourself muted unless you're talking or you're in a breakout session. I also want to acknowledge that talking about mental health can trigger emotions. So let's agree that everyone in this conversation does the best they can with what they have for the kids that are in their care. And we'll move forward. Again, take care of yourself.
All right, so a couple objectives today. Again, we're talking about the mental health repercussions of struggling to read. And so I just want to go over these 3 objectives real fast. First one, understand the mental health impact of reading struggles. Identify the importance of early intervention and learn some strategies for effective support and collaboration.
Okay, now's a good time to prepare a space for notes. As we go through the presentation, you may think of a particular student, or you may have a question. Go ahead and put it in the chat. Let us know that you'd like us to address something. Just remember, when we get into conversation, don't use student names or school names, because we are recording this and sharing this, and we want to protect the privacy rights of all involved.
So this is just a little blurb about the research behind the connection between struggling to read and negative mental health outcomes. So I'm just going to let you guys read this on your own before we get into the content.
What? I have that downloaded.
Okay, we'll move on.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna go over a few different mental health repercussions of struggling to read, and as we are talking about these things, like mental health is often one of those things when it co-occurs with other struggles that it's this mental dilemma of the chicken or the egg, right? What comes first, the mental health struggles that lead to learning struggles, or the other way around, right? And none of that is really important, because what we're talking about is early intervention and identifying these issues early on so we get support to students who need it, and making sure that we're taking care of the student holistically, right? All aspects of the student. So the first thing we're going to go over is how struggling to read can really, and really any learning difficulty can lead to increased risk of internalizing issues. And when I'm talking about internalizing issues, we're talking about depression, anxiety, cognitive overload, um, ongoing feeling hopeless or isolated in a reading struggle can lead to depression, that ongoing, like, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, right, leads to depression and feeling less than their peers. Cognitive overload is when a student is struggling to decode text, and this can exhaust their cognitive resources, which makes it harder to focus on comprehension and retention. And cognitive overload is really when we have excess demands on our working memory, right? Too many things are trying to happen at one time, and we exhaust our resources. And so this, we will talk a lot more later on. There's a slide about what this looks like, especially in those younger students. And there's a few statistics here that we pulled up in looking at the risk for depression between students who struggle to read and the general population. So you can just take note of those. There's definitely an increased risk for depression among students who have struggles reading. And that last bullet point is about dyslexia. Dyslexia. 40% of students with dyslexia have some form of an anxiety disorder, and many face depression.
So internalizing issues, what might this look like in a student who is 4 to 9 years old? I won't go over every one of these, but let's just talk about somatic complaints for a second. Some of this list is normal and a part of the adjustment period for starting kindergarten or preschool or starting at a new school. But it becomes concerning when it's persistent and it impairs learning and developmentally appropriate socializing. So let's think about some kids. They complain about a headache or a stomach ache or that they're tired. These kids may go to the secretary and school nurse multiple times a day. Can you think of a child like that? And it could be multiple reasons, and they could be sick. We're not denying that. But I had some kids that were strugglers over the years, and this was often their go-to because really they were trying to avoid. Or anxiety can feel like a stomach ache. It can feel like a headache. It can feel like they're tired. But so I would send these kids to the secretary, and the secretary was in on it, right? Oh, she would always say, give them a mint for their tummy. Send them back to class. They got a minute, they got a hug, they got to get a drink of water on the way back to class. But also peppermint is very strong, and it takes your mind off of everything else because you can really only focus on the strong flavor in your mouth. And sometimes they smell. So that's actually a little trick that we learned. But I also, if you have a kid that just needs a reset, like they're just really overstimulated, the secretary was also in on this. We would just send them down with a note. The note meant nothing. Sometimes there wasn't anything written in it, but she would write a note back to me and send them on their way. But also she tracked the time that kids came. We got to the point where we could track what's really going on with this child, what's happening before and after. Is it the reading block? What's triggering them? Is it just the part where they have small group? Is that what's happening? Is recess happen right before this? Were there interactions at recess that the kids that set them off, so on and so forth. So just thinking about some things like that can help you sort of get to the bottom of what's going on. Often with kids who struggle with learning, it is around the non-favorite learning activity, the part that's hard.
And I wanted to talk really quick and touch on this perfectionism, um, because this can be misinterpreted, right? A student who is struggling to read that all of a sudden is hyper focused on rules and routine and doing things the right way, or perfectionism can also manifest in like their appearance, their handwriting, other aspects in the classroom, right? As a way to make up for, right? Those perceived failures in other areas, right? And so you could see students that start to hyper focus on these other things, and have this sort of perfectionism complex, as it seems, right, on these other non-important areas that don't have to do with academics, right? And again, this is that internalizing, trying to make up for other aspects where they feel like maybe they're a failure, or they're not good enough, or so forth. The next one we're going to talk about is anxiety. Anxiety, kids who struggle to read may experience anxiety about reading tasks, fearing judgment for others, worrying about making mistakes. They may experience intense dread at the thought of being called on to read, or at the thought of having to read aloud, or complete some sort of task. Again, more statistics here about anxiety, but anxiety is a normal emotional response, right? We all know that. Everybody experiences anxiety. Anxiety becomes worrisome when it's excessive, right? When it starts interfering with their daily tasks, when they're struggling to sleep at night, when their emotional response doesn't seem to match the task, right? It may be a small task that you're asking them to do, but their anxiety seems to be blown out of proportion, right? And that constant state of being anxious or worried, right, leads to chronic feelings of anxiety that can cross over into clinical anxiety.
So again, what this might look like in our age group, the physical, my blank hurts, I don't feel good. One thing I learned when I worked with 4-year-olds was when they say, I don't feel good, and you usually say, where does it hurt? Or where are you not feeling good? And they might point to their stomach or point to their arm. I got in the habit of questioning, does it feel like a circle or a triangle? And going further, a circle is not pointy, so it might feel like a weight, but a triangle is pointy, so that could be a sharp pain, right? And and we got to just sort of identify what that felt like. To me, if it was a circle, it was probably anxiety. If it was a triangle, they might be going to throw up soon, right? So that's how you can tell the difference. And there's some, I think I learned that from it, oh gosh, I don't remember. But there's some work out there on that, like identifying what shape it might be, and helping kids just think about their body like that. But behavioral wise, there's that separation anxiety. My own daughter struggled with separating from me at school, and we came to find out it was all the transitions in her day, the different adults, a change in expectations, classmates acted out in less structured times. But it looked like separation anxiety, clinginess, sleeplessness, and worry, and fear were really big flags. Like at 11 o'clock, she would come and wake me up and want to talk about what I thought they would be doing in PE the next day. And that got to be like, I had to figure out that this was really a problem for her, that we were going to lose sleep about it, and we had to talk about it the whole way to school. And it wasn't September anymore. We were in December. So sometimes they just look like that, like they're trying to tell you something, but they don't know how.
And clinginess is more than separation anxiety. Clinginess can be like they're worried, they don't want you to leave when they're working on homework or they're working on a task, right? They want you to be there just in case they make a mistake or to double check their work or be there for help all the time. So again, another flag that they may be experiencing some anxiety around those reading tasks. All right, impact on self-esteem. Like we talked about on the first slide, right? Depression and feeling less than your peers because of the struggles that they're going through can have a huge impact on self-esteem. Feelings of inadequacy or failure, especially in the classroom. Um, Students with learning disabilities often report lower self-esteem significantly at significantly higher rates than peers without reading struggles.
So self-esteem in younger kids, they can be self-critical, right? They say negative things about their appearance or their abilities, or they're not smart, or I can't do that, or I don't know how to do that is often what you might hear. They compare themselves to others. They can become very hypersensitive to criticism or even just feedback in general. But another thing is they get to the point where others take advantage of them because they don't know how to get their needs met, or they may feel like they don't deserve to have it their way or have their needs met. Um, and a lot of times you might see that on the playground. Did you have anything to add to that, Courtney?
No, I don't think so. And all of the things that Jackie just went over, right, are things that can lead to pretty significant peer rejection, right? Students who struggle with reading are more likely to experience peer rejection, and I think that comes from a lot of different things, which Jackie will go over on the next page. But peer rejection is linked to anxiety and depression and low self-esteem, and that can be from their perceived struggles, right? The more that they struggle academically, the more distance happens between them and the other students in the class, right? There starts to be this separation between the struggling learners and the non-struggling learners, right? And that happens in social interactions between the kids. Um, yeah, sorry, I'll let you go. Jackie, there's a
That's
lot more on
okay.
the next page.
Um, so just think for a minute, the experience of being disliked. We're adults. We've been there at some point in our life. But the experience of being disliked, a perpetual experience, what that does. I can see a point for all of this. It's lonely, you're sad, you build anxiety, you're declining in performance. That doesn't feel good when you're not going to perform any better in academics when you constantly feel alone, right? Like every kid needs to have one buddy, but it just compounds and it gets worse and worse, and it's just increased issues.
And these slides seem a little backwards, right? Because these social challenges are really what leads to that peer rejection. Social challenges such as like being misunderstood, like not having the right words, being on a different like wavelength as far as communicating with their peers. These social challenges can lead to students wanting to avoid situations, especially ones that require reading or any kind of like out loud tasks. They may, like we talked about, going to the nurse, right? physically avoiding classrooms, right? When there is a reading task at hand, withdrawing socially in unstructured activities, kids that have a lot of anxiety, really fear unpredictable, right? So unstructured activities such as recess or free play, things like that can compound their anxiety and make them completely withdraw, right? So you may see them avoiding those situations, sitting off in the corner by themselves, avoiding playing with other kids, right? Um, again, more statistics here.
So just considering like a speech or language difficulty, or just communication in general, you're difficult to understand to your peers, right? Now, if a child goes through school with the same group of kids, those kids learn how to understand them. But when you're in kindergarten and it's your first experience with these peers, if they can't understand you, they will avoid trying to communicate with you. And then soon you start to avoid struggling to be understood because that doesn't feel good. You avoid being rejected by peers. So then there's frustration and anger and outbursts, and it's all just this circle that perpetuates. So academic stress. Consider constantly facing challenges with reading. Like we're sticking to reading, but this can be any academic difficulty. You're constantly facing challenges. A child who struggles to read and they're a fifth grader has been struggling to read for 6 years. Right? So that's constant 365 days a year being challenged by something that is hard for you. So frustration and heightened stress levels is to say the least. It definitely impacts your overall well-being.
All right, so earlier I mentioned that we were going to talk about some signs of cognitive overload. And remember, cognitive overload is when it's that state where students are struggling to process new information, right? Because too many things are happening. And that really can put us in two different states, right? We all have this window of tolerance as far as what we can handle. And then when we get pushed outside, right, is where we start to see some of these symptoms come in. When we're hyper aroused, when our anxiety is super high, or we're talking about kids here. When their anxiety is really high, they may feel super anxious, overwhelmed, angry, out of control. That's where you see that poor emotional regulation, the agitation, the restlessness. Um, and then on the other side, when you're overwhelmed for so long, you you can get put into what's called hypoarousal, where it's like this freezing state, right? Where you shut down. It's a shut down response. And that's where you see that deer in the headlights look, right? Difficulty concentrating, not remembering instructions, distractibility, right? Where you can't focus on anything when you're in shutdown mode, right? And the goal is optimal learning really happens when we're in our own window of tolerance, and everybody's window of tolerance may look different. But for students who are struggling with learning, they're very rarely going to be in that window of tolerance when they're struggling with all these other things, that those internalizing thoughts, right? I'm not good enough. I'll never get this. Everybody hates me, or whatever that may look like, right? It's very difficult for them to maintain that window of tolerance.
I think of when might we as adults experience the fight or flight or the hypo arousal. It happens when the last kid leaves after the Christmas party. The deer in the headlights, like you can't move forward. Just a little comic relief there, but who hasn't experienced that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, when I think about the hyper and the hypo arousal, right? Hyper arousal is at fight or flight, right? Hypo arousal is the freeze. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard fight, fight, or freeze, right? Like
Yeah.
that. Usually we talk about fight or flight, but not so much the freeze, right? The freeze is like, is that cognitive overload? There is so much happening that you freeze and you cannot move forward.
Mm-hmm. Or when you know your whole house needs to be deep cleaned, but you scroll Facebook or TikTok for 3 hours instead. It's the same. So now you have a chance to unpack this, okay? These are the big topics that we talked about. We're going to go into breakout rooms. And while we're doing that, think of a student who has struggled with reading or math or just academically in general. Which of these challenges did you see add to their struggles? And just feel free to talk about those experiences. Remember, leave kids' names out of it.
Maybe more factors that we need to be looking at and reaching out to help within our school.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share?
We talked about like that window of tolerance and how there's so many factors that can affect that, as well as talking about how, that trying to figure out if it's actually a physically sick or if it is a anxiety or something else compounding on that kind of sick, and talking about using like the circle and triangle as great ways to help us figure out how to manage it.
I will try to find some research and information on that circle and triangle thing because I found it extremely helpful with 4-year-olds who are not in touch with their emotions. So, did anybody else want to share before we move on? Courtney and I have a few more things to.
Yeah, Jackie, I just wanted to add because our group did talk about like the physical symptoms and how do you know when it's anxiety or when they're sick or when they're just faking or they just want to get out of things, right? And we talked about a lot of different symptoms of mental health symptoms. And it's about looking at, is there more to this, right? Like they may be sick today and maybe I think that they could be faking or trying to get out of it, but what else has happened this week or what other things are they experiencing and could there be more to this? So the negative feedback loop, I've kind of alluded to this as we've gone through this, but the more and more a kid struggles, right, the harder and harder it is to get out of this cycle, right? And this cycle we call the negative feedback loop, right? There's a struggle with reading, which leads to frustration, low confidence, or self-esteem issues, which then could turn into avoidance behaviors, avoiding classrooms, right? Avoiding instruction, trying to leave the class to go to the nurse's office, or not wanting to come to school, which then leads to academic consequences, right? Falling behind and so forth. More and more social rejection and isolation, more anxiety, emotional distress. And then we just start going around this cycle, right? And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger into a snowball. And without intervention, this doesn't stop. And so that's why it's important, and we'll go over that, to intervene early, right? Because this cycle will continue and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and more symptoms and struggles will be added in every time we go around.
So, breaking the cycle, these are some ways. Not just one, all of these things, targeted reading interventions. That's why we're all here, right? Encouragement and positive reinforcement, social emotional support, safe learning environments, family engagement. So we know that you all have positive and encouraging classrooms, right? But before, after, and later, right? when there's a social emotional event with a child, they need to have that positive and encouragement before, during, after, continuous, right? To remind them that, yeah, that was yesterday, today's a new day, and it's going to be great. Thinking about that learning environment. I need to say this, if kids are being picked on, then the learning environment is not safe. And to kids, the hallways, recess, specials are all part of the learning environment to them, right? We need to be aware of what's going on. That doesn't mean we have to be involved in every social interaction with kids, but we need to be aware of what's happening and how they're interacting with each other.
I want to highlight too on this loop that
Go back.
both reading interventions and social emotional support are part of it, right? It's not one or the other. It's not one at a time. It's both simultaneously, right? If a student is struggling with their mental health and is struggling with their learning, both need addressed, right? We can't, addressing one is not going to magically fix the other. We have to address them both and treat the whole child, right?
So the importance of early intervention. We can screen and monitor children from birth, right? Screening is they go back to the doctor 8 days after birth and they're measured and weighed. That's a screening. We monitor. Whether they're on target or not, we're still making sure they stay on target. If they're off target, we're doing certain things to intervene and then monitoring to see if that intervention worked. But also huge is collaboration. And I think Courtney has some great insight on collaboration.
So again, the importance of early intervention, right? We are trying to reduce the need for more intensive interventions later on. A first grader that gets intervention for dyslexia or social emotional struggles early on is going to get back on track. Whereas a fifth grader, they've been in that negative feedback loop for how long, right? Those issues are compounding and it's going to be harder and harder to break some of those negative cycles, right? That negative feedback to themselves, like how they talk to themselves, right? When they've been struggling to read and struggling with these peer interactions and social challenges since kindergarten and they're now in fifth grade, it's going to be a lot harder to intervene and change some of those thoughts for them. Again, we're trying to prevent the escalation of mental health issues and improve those academic outcomes. And those things happen and work best when we identify and intervene early on. Just as Jackie talked about screening and monitoring for academic process, the same is true for mental health, right? Identifying social skills that students may be struggling with early on and getting them support through whatever that may look like, whatever program your school has or whatever lessons you may implement into your classroom to build some of those skills. It's the same thing. If we intervene early with those social skills, students have a better chance of developing healthy interactions with themselves, meaning their mental capacity for talking to themselves and treating themselves with kindness and also with their peers. And then integrated support. It's important to collaborate with everybody, right? There are more than one adult in your school that's going to have contact with that student or can be a resource for you. If your student is struggling with what you think is mental health issues, such as intense anxiety or depression or peer rejection or whatever that may be, get other people involved, right? Integrate the support. And reduce the risk of social isolation and peer rejection. again, back to that fifth grader that's been in that negative feedback loop for 6 years. Imagine the peer rejection and isolation that student may feel, right, after years and years of being that kid that struggles, right, with reading, or that gets pulled out of class all the time because they can't be with their peers for that lesson or whatever that may be, right? We want to reduce that risk.
Just a few comments on literacy for early intervention. Dr. Connie Jewell did a study and found that children who are behind at the end of first grade have a 1 in 8 chance of catching up by the end of fourth. Okay, 1 in 8 is the same as 12%. And I've shared with, I think you've all heard me say the Dibbles scores. 12% of students who are well below at the end of first grade will become readers. That means 88% will not. All right, this isn't of first graders. These is just out of 100 students that are well below at the end of first grade. Only 12% of them will become readers with high quality instruction and intervention. We have to be on them sooner than first grade, right? We screen in Montana. We screen kids at 4 years old. We screen them even before that, right? They could have developmental screening when they're babies. But your LT screener that you use to determine eligibility is a dyslexia screener. We have to use that data to guide instruction and inform our systems, right? It's not enough to just give the screener and see if they qualify or don't. We have to do something with that data.
And I want to highlight too, as when I was working as an addiction counselor, I mainly worked with adult men that were involved in the criminal justice system. 10 times out of 10, those men, their mental health issues started early, when they were very little. A lot of the times they had discipline problems in school, right? Frequently going to the principal's office because of this or that. And really, if you look back and getting to know their life stories, they were struggling with mental health as far back as kindergarten, and not receiving the support, right? Being labeled as a disciplinary problem or whatever that may be. And I know we've come a long way just as a society since then. But that was one of the things that drew me into this prevention work, right? Is seeing these adult men. And I had men up to 70 years old in my groups that they did struggle to read even at 70 years old. They had mental health struggles from the time that they were 4 and 5 years old, and they never had intervention, right? And now I'm seeing them in my group as a 70-year-old with 5 DUIs, and in need of severe and intensive co-occurring treatment, inpatient treatment, right? These struggles are lifelong without intervention. Oh, sorry, I got on my soapbox there for a second. Individualized support. So again, assessment and identification. Comprehensive assessments are essential, both academic and emotional supports. We need to know where these students are at, both academically and socially. Targeted reading interventions. I know Jackie talked a lot about that. Mental health support and counseling. Your schools likely have a system in place for support, whether that be a school counselor, whether that be a community partnership that brings in maybe a licensed mental health provider into the school day, or a behavior interventionist. Get support. There's someone in your school that will be able to help. Know that system. What's the process for referral, right? How do I submit a referral? What constitutes a referral? Your school will probably, I'm not going to say they will, because I've worked with schools that don't have some of these systems in place, but know what you have in place and how to access it. And then customized classroom adjustments. Some things, simple classroom adjustments can really lower barriers to reading. Think about like different seating arrangements or extended time to complete tasks to reduce anxiety, ways to modify your classroom to reduce distractions, assistive technologies, sensory breaks, that cognitive overload. If you're seeing that, it may warrant sensory breaks. Even just a 5-minute movement break can really go a long way in helping anxious students like reset, return their focus to the task, redirect. And when collaborating with mental health professionals, it's very important that there's clear communication, right? Just sending the referral off and hoping and allowing them to do their job but not being in communication with them is not holistic, right? You're seeing that student more than anyone else. They're in your classroom, and as important it is for them to know what's going on in the classroom, it's also important for you to know what's going on over here with the mental health professional. So having clear communication between you and them, and integrate your intervention planning, right? Can there be some reading tasks that are tied to maybe some emotional skill lesson, right? Can we tie them together and integrate that planning process? And then joint interventions. Can we do some interventions together? Can we bring the mental health professional into the classroom or do a small group with the mental health professional? Work with them. Again, it may just be a school counselor, but they have access to different programming or lessons or whatever that may be to target some of these skill deficits as far as social emotional.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what just happened, but something did. So how does all this translate to LT programs? I'm going to let you read this slide.